I think to be Afghan American means to see all the perspectives.
Our community is incredibly resilient. Not a single Afghan likes to play the victim. Even though, we like to be incredibly courageous and brave, and it's, a very noble thing to do. However, sometimes we hide the pain and the struggle that we are going through privately.
19 years, 10 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days after the war in Afghanistan began.
Final U.S. military plane has left Afghanistan. President Biden is expected to speak a little bit later this morning about the end of America's longest war.
That was the choice, the real choice, between leaving or escalating. I was not going to extend this forever war, and I was not extending a forever exit.
This less than 2 weeks after the Afghan government collapsed and the Taliban took over Kabul. Refugees from Afghanistan fleeing the Taliban have begun filing into other countries. A diaspora of fear, resiliency, community, culture, not unlike the waves of refugees seeking respite from the Soviet-Afghan war 42 years ago. By 1984, approximately 10,000 refugees found their way to the U.S. and Canada. Some settling in the San Francisco Bay Area, where one city already boasts the biggest population of Afghan Americans in the United States. In this episode, we'll hear from 2 members of the Afghan Coalition of the Bay Area. One, a local council member, the other, a policy analyst. Both children of Afghan refugees. They'll tell us how the Afghan community has been able to maintain its culture in the region following a long trek and decades of war at home, and the barriers facing Afghan immigrants, especially women, to this day. I'm Lynda Lopez, and this is Connect the Dots from Audacy. Fremont, California. It's nestled in the Bay Area's Alameda County, 43 miles from San Francisco, and just 2 towns north of San Jose and the well-known Silicon Valley. As of 2019, a town of approximately 236,000 residents, which could grow a little more with incoming refugees from Afghanistan. Fremont is home to the biggest population of Afghan Americans in the U.S.
If you were to go to Fremont, you'll see Afghan restaurants, you'll see Afghan grocery stores, you'll see Afghan businesses, you'll see mosques, you'll see that there is a vibrant community culture of for Afghan Americans.
Connect the Dots producer Mallory Samara spoke with Harris Mojadedi, a member of the Afghan Coalition of the Bay Area and policy analyst at UC Berkeley, about the Afghan diaspora in the Bay Area and how older generations of refugees are being impacted by what's happening in Afghanistan today.
With the increase of the presence of Afghanistan on the news and in media outlets, how do you think the portrayal of the current conflict affects Afghan Americans living here in the U.S.?
Well, there's so many different ways to look at this issue, but I would say my community, the Afghan American community, we've been in the United States for about 40 years. Many of us are refugees or the sons, daughters, children of refugees. So I'd say in the past probably 30 or 40 years that we've been in the United States, we haven't been in the limelight, right? We've sort of, I'd say growing up myself, people didn't know where Afghanistan was. And it wasn't until 9/11 when people were able to know where Afghanistan was on the map. But, unfortunately, it was associated with terrorism, with Osama bin Laden. So I think in many ways, what we're seeing right now, the events taking shape in Afghanistan, it's really, I'd say, the first time that people are seeing us, that we're being humanized, that people are seeing the pain and suffering that this community has endured for 40 years, whether that's in Afghanistan or whether it's diaspora communities. The broader community hasn't seen the pain that we've experienced, the atrocities that we've witnessed, the sort of ires of war. No one has really humanized that. And so what we're seeing in the past 18 days is the first time that we're being seen, that we're being heard, that people are coming to us and saying, this is so wrong. How can we help you? How can we support you? How can we uplift you? And there's no words to describe. It's as if suddenly we matter.
Have you noticed a difference in generations? You know, how different generations are taking in some of the news?
That's a really good question. I would say it's impacting different generations in different ways. I think that's a really good question that you posed. I'd say for my parents who are refugees in their generation, they're reliving their own actual traumas of escaping Afghanistan, and they're witnessing that with the images that they see, that they've seen at the airport in Kabul or that they have seen in Afghanistan. And so for them, feelings and emotions are coming up to the surface that maybe have been dormant for decades because they're literally reliving their own traumas. And then I would say for my generation, and I'm 31 years old, folks in my era who we may not have actually experienced that trauma, we're experiencing that intergenerational trauma, that collective trauma. No words to describe it other than, even though we directly didn't experience that trauma, we're now witnessing firsthand what that experience has been for our parents. I know for myself, I've been trying to help my family members escape from Afghanistan. And so for me, going through passports and forms and the pain and the fear of how do I get these loved ones out? It's so in that way, I would say my generation is experiencing that sort of fear of my loved ones, their safety is on the line. And so I feel like it's hitting us in different ways, but collectively, I'd say this diaspora community, we're all going through this collective trauma where it's all coming to the surface all at once.
And I'm sure, having all of this coverage sort of available anywhere and everywhere has sort of lent to that too as well, right? Because it's not the same as it was 30, 40 years ago. Now we're seeing it everywhere. And so there must be good and bad parts to that, right?
Yeah, Mallory, that's a really good question. I'd say that the good parts are that, if there are any good parts to this crisis, which that's questionable, but I'd see what has been heartening has been that there really is, I'd say across the board, willingness to support this refugee community that's coming in. I'm witnessing it. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm witnessing it through the work that local governments are doing at the city level, that county governments are doing. There's been so much support from our federal representatives in Congress. And to me, that's so heartening. It is really the birth of, I would say, America's newest constituency, the Afghan American. We are taking shape in the ways in which we are advocating. So I think that's heartening to see that we are going to our elected officials. We're going through different governmental agencies and really speaking about the importance of support services for this new arrival of refugees. And I'd say what's also different about this particular wave of refugees from Afghanistan is that these folks and individuals have been in support of our mission in the United States. They share our ideals and values. They have worked in support of our armed service members. They've worked in institutions like the American University. They've taught at schools for girls, and they share our ideals, values. They can speak English, not all of them, but they're familiar with our culture, which is vastly different than my parents or the first wave of refugee arrivals 40 years ago, where they didn't know too much about America or the culture. So I think that'll definitely play into what the assimilation or acculturation process of these refugees look like. But that's been really the heartening part of this crisis, is to see the support from our broader community, to see ourselves really humanized.
Fremont is supposed to have the largest population of Afghan Americans in the United States. Do you know of what the city or the state or, local officials have been doing to be welcoming of your community?
Historically, in the United States, Fremont really has been the center of the Afghan American diaspora community. What that has in turn done in the response that we're seeing is that the city of Fremont has, they have a relief fund for refugees. We're beginning to see that resettlement agencies work really closely with county and city governments. And so this is all really evolving very quickly. It's only been a few weeks, but I think in that few weeks, just the response, the sort of support that we are seeing for the Afghan American community has just been so tremendous and overwhelming. I know that the city of Sunnyvale, which is in the South Bay, they passed a resolution in support of the Afghan community. We're now, that's something that I'm pushing to have other cities and governmental agencies really affirm that the Afghan American community is a vital part of our Bay Area, and really a part of the fabric of the United States. And so that has been heartening. And I think in the coming weeks, we'll begin to see more concrete plans. But I think as it is right now, there are, different stakeholders are beginning to meet. I've witnessed it myself in sort of the beginning of the coordination process between resettlement agencies and city and county governments. So I'm very hopeful at this time and really grateful, again, just to be seen and to have our experience humanized.
Do you know when this population grew the most?
This population of Afghan Americans, I'd say, probably throughout the entire decade of the 1980s, if not into the early 90s, Afghanistan had the largest refugee population in the world. So the most amount of refugees in the world at any given year throughout the decade of the 80s belonged to Afghanistan. And so that population I would say in Fremont, the San Francisco Bay Area where I'm from, it really began to increase, I'd say, in the early 80s as folks were fleeing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I think part of the reason why Fremont might be, or the Bay Area might be such a large, home to such a large concentration of Afghan Americans is that we had Afghan doctors here. And so when I think about my parents and their generation, just having medical professionals that spoke their language, seeing grocery stores pop up, halal butcher shops pop up. And I think also word of mouth too. I know that when my parents first came here, they were told you should come to Fremont because there is an Afghan doctor or there's someone that speaks Farsi. And so that sort of word of mouth traveled. And I know that at least in my context, we've had family friends who they might have came to other parts of the country first, maybe Wyoming and Texas, but they soon migrated to Fremont just because of the fact that there was community. And when you think historically, right, like there wasn't the internet at the time, there wasn't social media, people didn't know what America was or the culture was. So just knowing that, hey, there's a halal butcher shop, there's a mosque, like those are really, I know foundational things, but at the time were huge. And so I think that's sort of how our story began in the United States.
I'm curious, do you know professionally or like industry wise what people who migrated here, who were refugees here, do you know what sort of like industry they ended up in here?
Yeah, well, I'd say the Afghan American population, we have been so vital to the economy of the United States. You see Afghan Americans in so many governmental jobs. You see them working in different social services agencies and in the county level, in the city level. You also see Afghans in the tech sector. I know people in my generation, they studied STEM, and so they're engineers in Silicon Valley. We also have so many poets and authors and writers, Khaled Hosseini, who wrote The Kite Runner, who's also from the Bay Area and Fremont. And our community has been vital in so many different sectors. I can't just point to like they've chosen one route, medicine or engineering or technology. I think we've been really a part of all the different sectors.
Do you know of any, like as far as demographics go, why were certain people coming here to the Bay Area or Fremont rather than, I know that there's another community in, I think it's North Virginia, that also has the second biggest Afghan American community in the US. Like, do you know why certain people like the demographic of the folks who ended up coming here?
So I'd say that first wave of refugees that came here, you have to think that Afghanistan really overnight, when there was a communist revolution in 1978, the government drastically changed. It became communist, and anyone who was a dissident, anyone who disagreed, whether they were business leaders, religious leaders, whether they were just anti-communist, whether they were part of the ruling class before, whether they had nobility, whether they were whatever they were. I think that was really the first brain drain in Afghanistan, is you had these wealthy, higher class leaders in society, right, that were essentially either murdered or had to evacuate because they were being targeted. And so you see in that first wave in the early mid 80s, people that really belonged to the intelligentsia, people that were thought leaders, leaders in scholarly religious leaders, business leaders, landowners. You saw them flee because they were under direct attack by the communist regime. I know in my instance, my own grandfather was taken away by the communists, and our family never heard of him again. And so this isn't anything that's unique, right? A lot of anyone who's a dissident to this communist government was really, they had to flee, they had to leave Afghanistan. And so that's really that first wave that we saw. And then I think there's also a brain drain going on right now. You're seeing all the people that the best and brightest in Afghanistan, you're seeing them want to flee. And so that's happening in a different capacity 40 years later. But yeah, I'd say it's definitely a brain drain both times.
How has your community been able to maintain their cultural identity in the U.S., in Fremont, the Bay Area, but also just in the U.S. in general?
Yeah, so I'd say in terms of preserving our cultural identity, many Afghans, when they first came to the U.S. back in the 80s, the thought process was, okay, there's a war going on right now because there's a communist government in Afghanistan, but should that communist government fall, well, we can return back home. And so I think for many refugees and many members of our community, when arriving, the notion wasn't, I'm going to stay long term and be American. It was, I'm going to go back home to Afghanistan when the conflict is over. But, as we've now seen, that conflict never really resolved. There was one conflict after another the past 40 years. And so I think just that initial, we're in the United States, but we're probably going to go back home. I think that really allowed for the culture to be maintained. I know that because we had a large diaspora population in the San Francisco Bay Area, we had community events. We had our Nowruz festivals and programs, and I know in high schools had Afghan clubs where you would do, you have a yearly assembly where the different cultural clubs perform, and that was true for me in my own experience. And I think it just helped that there was and really a blessing of my experience growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area is that I would go in my classroom, there would be other Afghan students. We'd have sort of the same shared identity of, our parents have they're more conservative. We can't go outside like to the movies or get an allowance, or so that sort of community was built. And I'm really grateful for that, because I know that that's not the experience for many refugee communities, and I know that had I been born in, a different state, maybe in the South, maybe in the Midwest, that I wouldn't have had that experience that I had growing up. And so I think that that's been a way that we've really been able to preserve that cultural identity. And I think as we look to the future, I think it's even more important that we preserve this culture, because what's taking shape in Afghanistan, right? It's something completely different. And the music, whether it's musical instruments or singing or dance or poetry, which are so important to Afghans, we're seeing an erasure of that culture. And so I think it's going to be even more critical to preserve sort of these traditions that we have.
You mentioned this notion of returning to Afghanistan, and I'm curious because, my grandmother, she came here from the Philippines and she lived through World War II there. And I think because of everything that she had seen there, And my mom is American born, but because of everything that my grandma saw there, she did not want me traveling to the Philippines at all. And she never went back and had no interest in going back to the Philippines. So where do you think that notion of returning home is going? Do you think that the hopes of returning home have dwindled, and do you think it'll change?
I think that sort of hope of returning home, at least for the current diaspora population in the United States, my family were Afghan Americans. We were proud to be Afghan Americans. We passed that initial few years in the 80s. We're proud to be American citizens and part of this country and this culture. It's part of who we are. It's in our DNA. And so I think for this particular wave of refugees that my family belongs to and many of our community members belong to, I think that notion of returning to home, it dissipated really quickly. We're proud to be American and to be contributing to this society in this country. And that's something just beautiful to hold both of those pieces together. I'd say the notion of returning home in terms of what it means to be someone who's a descendant or has Afghan descent is changing quickly. I don't think that folks have necessarily had the time to process that yet, just because we're in, for me, right, I'll use myself as an example. I'm trying to get my family members out of Afghanistan just to make sure that they're safe. So I haven't had time to think about, how do I identify? What does that look like for me? What if this new government that is taking shape before our eyes, but if it doesn't represent me, do I tell? I think that it's so new. It's such a new concept. I don't know what that identity means to me now. And I think that we're seeing that amongst our community. Part of the pain is that I think there's also a mourning. We're mourning the loss of this 5,000-year-old identity, which has signified so much, the birthplace of Rumi, the birthplace of the Enneagram, where Buddhism really took root and shape before it went to the East, the Silk Road, this place of all of these different faiths and people living together in harmony, and the culture really, we're witnessing an erasure of that. And so I think part of what our community across the globe is experiencing is this loss, this mourning of this identity, right? We saw it with symbolically the flags being removed in Afghanistan. And so I think that it's so soon. I don't think that there is quite an answer yet to describe that, but I think it's evolving and it's taking shape.
And finally, what does it mean to be Afghan American?
Gosh, I don't know if I'll do justice to that question, but I'll try my very best to answer. I think to be Afghan American means to see all the perspectives, right? I think my heritage, Afghanistan has there's so many differences, and oftentimes we see the way that this country or this region is divided. But I think for me, being of this heritage, it allows me to see people. It allows me to understand the nuances and the differences. But it also, for me personally, this heritage that I come from, it makes me so grateful to be an American. I'm such a proud citizen of the United States because I have, from what I've heard from my family members, right, my grandfather's government, because he disagreed with the point of view and took a stance, he was taken away, right? And it makes me so great. And it makes not only me, but my community, it makes us so proud to be Americans because we know we've lived what happens when governments are not for the people. And it makes us honor, right, the right to vote, these important things that we oftentimes take for granted. I think what it means to be Afghan American is really what it means to be American, to believe and uphold these liberties and values. And I think of it as one and the same. And I think that, at least in my own experience, because I can only, right, I can't speak for every Afghan American, I can't speak for every American, but I know in my own lived experience, the stories that I've heard, the things that have happened to my family, it makes me just even more a fervent supporter of our democracy, of our ideals, of our values. And I never take that for granted, right? And I know many members in my community, we never take it for granted, whether it's making sure to vote every election, whether it's knowing who our elected officials are, or whether, I think it's so important because we witnessed, what can happen on the other side.
About 13 miles north of Fremont, a 20-minute drive, or 30 in Bay Area traffic, is Hayward, California, where Afghan American Aisha Wahab, also a member of the Afghan Coalition, serves as mayor pro tempore, making her the first Afghan American elected to public office in the United States.
People are just paying attention to after 9/11. But Afghanistan has been dealing with this since the mid-70s.
Wahab, who is also running for a seat in the California State Senate, said that the Afghan community here in the States was expecting the Taliban to take over their homeland long before it made headlines.
Primarily because many of us watch Afghan news and media. And we usually have like a friend or somebody that's going to be traveling to Afghanistan or from Afghanistan. And, they probably have the most up-to-date and accurate information when you talk to them. And the Taliban were actually taking cities in northern Pakistan prior to even coming into Afghanistan. And so we saw this, a mile away, if you will, right? Like roughly in July, to be completely frank. With that said, after the fall of Kandahar, it was pretty much a given that the rest of the country would be taken. Kandahar is actually kind of more of symbolic in some ways, in the sense of, where the country is going to go. And when they took over Kabul, it was pretty much a done deal after that. Right? It was complete after that. But Kandahar was definitely the signal.
In response to the crisis in Afghanistan, members of the Afghan diaspora communities in the U.S., including first-generation Americans like Wahab, have been working to provide aid.
To be frank with you, there's not a single generation of Afghans alive today that have not been directly or indirectly affected by war, myself included. I am the daughter of refugees myself. And with that said, many of the young Afghan professionals have been really stepping up, taking leave of absences from their work and their day-to-day lives to be able to help interpret for the women and children that are coming. The interpreters speak English, but their children may not. There's also certain nuances and level of depth of knowledge in Afghan culture that some of these agencies do not have an understanding of. So a lot of Afghans have been helping around that. There has been significant support in regards to donation drives, food drives, fundraising, both for Afghanistan as well as locally, as well as campaigns to educate our elected officials, as well as the demonstrations to stand with the Afghan people and not with the warlords or with the Taliban.
For example, Wahab's own community in Hayward and other areas of California have stepped up to organize efforts to help Afghan refugees, along with elected officials in the state.
I think that the city of Hayward has really stepped up. This is an international humanitarian crisis, and the city is working to connect community members to critical services in multiple languages. We are making sure that we aren't duplicating efforts and that we're collaborating and putting the people that are really the subject matter experts at the forefront. And if there's interest, a concern of getting involved and so forth, we are directing volunteers to the appropriate agencies. There have been many people that have reached out to me, from the San Jose Human Rights Institute to the Berkeley Law Department, that is trying to provide some support with immigration and so forth. Your everyday Afghan American, our local Congress member, his office, his staff, as well as the other Congress members throughout the Bay Area that are seeking to provide support. We have other elected officials that have reached out to me saying, Aisha, we don't have anything to do with, being able to provide, housing or extra services or anything like that. But, I'm happy to have a staff person help on any efforts that you may have. So there's been a lot of that, to be completely frank.
In Colorado, another state with a sizable Afghan American population, Congressman Jason Crow's office has also pledged to help people who are at risk in Afghanistan. Other states, such as Minnesota, have also welcomed refugees. Yet, getting people out of Afghanistan is only part of the struggle.
The biggest barrier to coming here is just getting here. It's being accepted. It's being, going through the process and making sure their entire family's potentially with them. What people need to understand is the nuances of the special immigrant visa. The special immigrant visa recipients were guaranteed to be able to come to the United States with their spouse and children under the age of 21. If they have a child 21 and above, they are saying goodbye to their children. And I don't think people realize that. And it's not one child or two children. They may potentially have 6 children. Families there are very different than the nuclear family here that we see with maybe 1 or 2 kids at most.
If Afghan families are able to make it to the States, settling here can be challenging, especially for women.
In the U.S., the difference is going to be, again, mostly affecting women. Can they get a job? Or are they going to be isolated because they do not speak English? Are they going to be isolated because maybe their husband is struggling with, having their wife work or go outside or interact with, people that they don't know and so forth. The children bounce back pretty quickly. They're pretty resilient. And, within a year, they're wearing jeans and Nikes and, can move on with their day-to-day activities and speak the language and have friends. The special immigrant visa recipients, the main interpreters, they'll have a little bit of an easier time, but they'll be stressed in providing for their families because one paycheck won't make it here, right? Housing, transportation, education, healthcare, the cost of food, the cost of living here in the Bay Area is extremely high, let alone one paycheck versus, now potentially their wives are going to have to work and, what type of job are they really going to get? So that's going to be a whole different ballgame. As a board member of the Afghan Coalition as well, I have seen us interact with what's going to be needed with the special immigrant visa recipients and what they truly are going to go through. And it's usually their wives that are struggling. There is domestic violence, there is mental health issues, there is a wide variety of other things that the entire family deals with. But the wives are the ones that are the most isolated. And some of them have committed suicide right here in the Bay Area. And that is often not highlighted. And with war, I want to say that the larger Afghan community does struggle with mental health. We're talking about anything from anxiety, depression, isolation, some of these things that are a little bit more manageable to things that are far more difficult, like schizophrenia. Many self-medicate, many, have to deal with their trauma, and many are very much alone. Again, very much alone. So I think that it's going to be a huge concern moving forward for these families. And, as the, member of the young professional Afghans that are here, it is definitely our job to kind of help as much as we can. But, hopefully they all find some peace in the Bay Area.
When it comes to mental health, Wahab explained that young Afghan Americans often volunteer their time to help others in their community, offering pro bono services and taking time out of their careers.
The Afghan Coalition does help with mental health. I will say I also have a friend who is literally doing pro bono casework, providing mental health services. She's a LMFT, a licensed marriage and family therapist. There's a lot of young people that are offering their services there. Like I said, the professional network amongst young Afghans in the United States is pretty broad. There's many that are lawyers and doctors and so forth. So, the fact that, so many young professionals are taking leaves of absences just to be able to help where they can is commendable and incredible.
So how can people help out Afghan refugees and Afghan Americans?
If they want to go to hayward-ca.gov/Afghan relief, we have an entire page dedicated to the Afghan relief and assistance efforts. They can fill out an inquiry form and potentially, ask how can we help, whether, that's working with the Afghan Coalition, whether that's working with the Jewish Family and Community Services of the East Bay, whether that's donating or anything like that. You'll have some useful information there. We update the website roughly twice a day. And we have links if people care more about the efforts around advocacy, which we always need help on, things like that they can help in any way that they please. And just, if you do meet an Afghan, just being kind and considerate is incredibly helpful at this moment in time.
As the situation in Afghanistan continues to develop, war will continue to shape the Afghan diaspora in America. Connect the Dots plans to check in with the East Bay community and others across the nation in the coming months. This episode of Connect the Dots was written and produced by Lauren Barry and Sydney Fishman. It was executive produced and edited by Mallory Samara. Until next week, I'm WCBS News Radio's Lynda Lopez.